This Sunday, we begin our new worship series called Walking with Jesus as we study the Gospel of Luke, and in particular, the people that we meet in the various stories within the Gospel of Luke. I had hoped to be preaching this sermon live on Sunday morning, but it didn't turn out that way. The inevitable has happened, and a member of our household has been identified as a close contact, and out of an abundance of caution, I'm pre-recording this for our Sunday morning worship time together. The Gospel of Luke is the story of Jesus as told by Luke. Now, who is Luke, and why is he writing this gospel? Well, Luke is not one of the apostles, and he's not one of the original group of disciples. What we do know about him is that he was a physician, a doctor. Now, a doctor in those days was not quite the same thing that we would think of today as being someone concerned only with medical concerns. A doctor, a physician, would have been someone very interested in knowledge and education and understanding the world around them. We also are quite certain that Luke was not Jewish. He was most likely a Syrian believer, a Gentile and outsider. We know that Luke traveled with Paul at some point. Particularly, we know that he traveled with Paul on his last journey to Jerusalem when he was arrested and taken for trial. Now, as someone who is concerned about knowledge, Luke has undertaken a project to interview the eyewitnesses who have seen and heard Jesus speaking and teaching and healing and the events of his life, as well as to learn from the apostles and those who walked with Jesus during those years of his life. And to take all of this and to set it down in what he calls an orderly manner, a definitive story of the person of Jesus. One of the things that is important for Luke as an outsider, a Gentile, is that he wants the reader of this gospel to understand the person of Jesus, to understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecies, and not just the promised Messiah for the people of Israel, but that Jesus was the Son of Man, the one who would redeem all of humanity. Luke writes not only this gospel, but he also writes the second part of this work, which is the Acts of the Apostles, which is part 2. In part 1, Luke writes about the life of Jesus. In part 2, Luke writes about the life of the church as it carries on with the work and the ministry of Jesus as they are commissioned by Jesus himself. And so we have the stories of Jesus as heard by Luke, as written down, as put together in a way that we can understand the person and the purpose of Jesus and his ministry among us, his death and his resurrection. We've called this series Walking with Jesus. To continue on with our theme of walking since this past fall. In the fall, we talked about Jesus' faithfulness and how God fulfills his promises to us. We talked about walking through the valleys, times of disappointment and trial and fear. And we talked about walking in faith through the book of Hebrews as we learned about how God has fulfilled each and every promise to humanity and to the people of Israel as Jesus comes and is the better high priest, the better mediator, the better sacrifice, and someone who is worthy of our trust as we walk with him. As Luke narrates this story of the life of Jesus and his teachings, along the way we encounter many different characters and people in the stories. And as we read and study this gospel, we can learn from these people that Jesus walks with. And in those stories, we can also see glimpses of ourselves, as each of those characters has elements in their life and their experience that resonate with our own. And in this way, as we enter into these stories, we too will grow in our insight and understanding as to the meaning of the good news and what a meaning of walking with Jesus in our daily lives. It's the beginning of the year. January is part of the new year, and often at this time of the calendar, we set ourselves a new course, a new path. We know, this last year, I started slipping up in some of my habits, and I didn't do some of the things that I know are good for me. And so we often at this time of year choose to get ourselves onto a better path, to reorient ourselves, to make resolutions and commitments about how we will walk in a better way in the coming year. And this is good, because to choose a better path, to choose a path that leads to the place that we want to go, is something that is within our grasp. And with help and with those around us and encouragement, we can succeed. But I think the broader question is, when you think about the scope of your daily life, the experiences that you are a part of day to day, what is the path that you find yourself on today? Is it a path that you are choosing? Is it something that you have deliberately and intentionally chosen for yourself? A path that leads to new things and adventures, experiences, a path towards growth and fulfillment, using your gifts and fulfilling your potential? Or are you on a path that you have not chosen for yourself? A path that seems to have been given to you because of the circumstances of life. A path filled metaphorically with rocks and muddy puddles and pitfalls and twists and turns and signs that don't seem to give you much information about where you're actually headed. But a path that you did not choose for yourself. Or are you on a path that you don't really know much about? A path that you didn't really choose, and you're not really sure where it's going, but hey, the road in front of you is pretty smooth, and you're moving at a good pace, and there's a lot of people headed in the same direction, so you're pretty confident that it's probably going to take you somewhere good. Or maybe you find yourself on a narrow track that is sometimes clear and straight, but often difficult to discern. A path in which you seem to often be the only one headed in that direction. And you're not always sure that this is actually the direction that you meant to go as you began walking through this path. Whatever path you find yourself on today, I want to encourage you that with Jesus by our side, and with the strength of the Spirit that walks with us through Jesus, we can choose a better path. We can choose a path that leads to better places. And there is no better road to be on than a road in which you find Jesus as your traveling companion. The image that we are using for this sermon series is called On the Way to Emmaus. You will have seen it earlier on in the service. It's taken from one of the stories in Luke 24. The image that we are using is a painting by Janet Brooke Gerloff, painted in 1992. It's a very interesting image that captures my imagination. After the death of Jesus, two disciples who were in Jerusalem, who saw his triumphal entry perhaps, who saw and heard the crowds, who were there for his trial, his condemnation, his crucifixion and death, and his burial, don't know where to go next. So they head out of Jerusalem, likely on the road back to home, headed to Emmaus, down the dusty road. In the painting, you can see these two disciples fully realized in dark colors, substantial, and yet somehow heavy, with confusion and disappointment, wondering where to go, what to do next, now that this rabbi that they have invested themselves in, this person, this teacher, this prophet that they have been following, now that he is gone. It hasn't happened the way that they thought it would. And as they walk down that dusty road, they are joined on the path by Jesus, but they don't recognize him. In the image before us, Jesus is expressed by an outline. He is there, and yet he is not fully seen. He is not recognized by the disciples. In Luke 24, verse 16, it says very clearly, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. As they walked down that road, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Why didn't they recognize him? These are disciples who knew Jesus. They had heard him teach. They had watched him perform miracles. They had listened as he challenged the religious authorities and taught with one who had real authority and understood the words and the will of God. They knew his voice. They knew his face. So why in this moment, as they're walking along, do they not recognize him? Was it Jesus that was keeping them from recognizing him? Was this somehow some sort of divine practical joke? They hadn't heard about his resurrection. Wouldn't this be a grand joke to reveal, aha? I don't think that's that at all. That doesn't seem at all like the person and character of Jesus that we know. Why would Jesus play a joke on them? No, that doesn't seem like it at all. When I hear those words, their eyes were kept from recognizing him, it seems to me that the most likely reason is that they weren't looking for him or expecting him at all. The Jesus they knew was dead in the grave. No matter the resemblance of this stranger to the Jesus they knew or the voice that seemed somehow familiar, there's no way that it could have been Jesus, and so they didn't recognize him. They did not know that he had triumphed over death. They did not know the good news yet. There's a striking image in verse 17 of this story. As he's walking with them, he asks them, "What are you discussing while you're walking along?" They've been discussing how things haven't been turning out, how the man that they thought was the promised one, perhaps, no, not perhaps, definitely wasn't the Messiah because he had died. And then there's this poignant phrase, "They stood still looking sad." They stood still looking sad. They were lost, confused, disappointed. And it is in that place of their disappointment and loss that Jesus comes to them and finds them and walks with them down that dusty road with their heavy hearts. He meets with them and speaks with them. What does he say as he walks with them? We read in the story of Luke 24 that he asks them, "What's going on? Why are you so sad?" And they tell him what they know of the Jesus that they loved that has now been put to death. And then Jesus begins to speak. He speaks to them of the fulfillment of prophecy, the words from the prophets, the promises and the faithfulness of God. And as he speaks to them, he reminds them of what Jesus himself spoke to them earlier. And he tries to reassure them that their faith has not been in vain. As they reach their destination in Emmaus, they invite Jesus to sit down with them and to eat. And it is as they do so, as the familiar movements of blessing and breaking the bread happen, that they see and they recognize that this was Jesus who was with them all along. Do we see Jesus on the path that we are on? Do we recognize him in the midst of our daily lives? Our disappointments, our struggles, our sadness, our certainty that things are not going to be the way that we thought they were. The doubt that we carry that God can fulfill the promises that we've read in the scriptures. That Jesus maybe, might not be with us in our need. We learn here from the story of the road to Emmaus that Jesus meets us where we are and walks with us. And so too, as we walk through the Gospel of Luke, we will learn from each of these stories. The stories of Jesus meeting people where they are, with all of their baggage, with all of their sin and brokenness, with all of their struggles, their questions, their doubts, their personalities and personality flaws, and there's a lot of them. Jesus meets and walks with each of them in different ways. And as we enter into these stories, we can be reminded and reassured that he meets with us with all of our baggage, with all of our sin, with all of our struggles, our questions and doubts, and even with our personality and character flaws. And just as he meets with them where they are and invites them to choose a better path, a path that walks in the way of the kingdom, a path that invites them to be a part of the good news story of the gospel, we too are reminded Jesus is faithful. God's promises are trustworthy. And we too are reminded and assured that we are known, that we are loved and embraced by this Jesus who has called us. And more importantly than being known and loved and embraced, we are called and commissioned to walk with him, to bring the good news to everyone we meet, and to share the story of Jesus with the world that we live in. May we walk with Jesus each and every day. Amen.
In response, I